How do you keep the cottage in the family? We'll explore 6 challenges. Welcome to Tea at Taxevity, where you get insights from insiders, our many clients and friends. I'm Pramod Sharma, the actuary at Taxevity. I help people who care about sustainable financial independence harness the power of life and health insurance. Our guest today is Katy Basi. Welcome, Katy.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us. What do you do when you're not being interviewed?
I am a wills and estates lawyer. I also have an income tax law practice. And in my off hours, such as they are, I schlep around my 14-year-old twin boys.
Twins, my goodness.
It's exciting.
Do you have a family cottage?
My dad owns our family cottage, which was built by my great-grandfather in the 1930s and has managed to make its way whole down to my father. And I've had the task of making sure that hopefully it will stay in the hands of me and my sisters for the next generation.
Congratulations, because I understand there are many challenges that people have in passing the cottage on even to the next generation.
Most definitely.
And I read an article that you wrote for the Blunt Bean Counter, and it was about cottages, and that's the basis of our discussion. So what I'll do is I'll just mention a few things in here, and then I'll ask you to maybe explain more about them for our audience. There are some things that are unique about cottages, and one of them is the emotional resonance. Now, you are part of a family that has a cottage. What are the sorts of issues?
Well, people generally, especially where a cottage has been in the family for many years, or even in some cases a few generations, they have a hard time being rational about the cottage. Often children want to keep the cottage at all costs, or parents want their children to keep the cottage at all costs. And the logical decision making that can normally occur seems to fly out the window for cottages.
Okay, that does sound like it would be a challenge, because I guess people have their childhood memories, the parents have the dreams that the future generations will have this land.
Absolutely. You know, the adult children who are waiting to inherit the cottage from the parents remember spending their childhoods and learning to swim at the cottage, learning to canoe at the cottage, and they want their own children to have those same experiences and get a little heartbroken at the thought that that might not happen.
You also raised the challenge of cottages being expensive to maintain.
Well, it's expensive enough to have one primary residence and to maintain that at your regular place of living, but then to also have the maintenance expenses associated with the second home, being the cottage, property taxes, utilities, and so on. You're maintaining that cottage for 12 months of the year, even though you may only use it for 3 or 4 months of the year, and it can be quite a heavy financial burden.
Okay, that's an interesting point, yes, because you don't use the cottage all year unless it's winterized, but that's even more expensive.
Exactly.
Okay, now related to the expenses, I guess at the moment we're thinking of parents who own the cottage and they're trying to keep it within the family. So do you find that parents have issues with the expenses, or is it more potential issues that the children would have?
Normally, the parents, if they've owned the cottage for a while, have figured out how to handle the maintenance expenses. The concern is more whether their children will be able to do so. Sometimes there's a child that's well off, and the parents feel that that child will take care of all the cottage expenses. But often there are children who are barely scraping by in their regular life, and to add the burden of cottage maintenance on top of their current financial expenses is not terribly doable for them.
And the child who does have the money may not think it's fair to pay for all those expenses when other siblings are getting the benefits also.
Well, we get into very interesting situations of, yes, should one child pay for everything? If that one child pays for everything, should the non-paying child be able to go and spend a month at the cottage essentially for free? And those types of questions can lead to disagreements between the children and fractures in the relationships between the children. And that's the very last thing that the parent wants. But in a sense, the parent might have created that problem by how they dealt with the cottage in the first place.
It seems that cottages have been good investments, which means that they've appreciated in value, and that creates the issue of capital gains tax.
Right. You know, we get so happy at looking at the value of a cottage that we spent $150,000 on that's now worth, $400,000, but it's not real money in the sense that you're living in it and enjoying it. And the problem is that when a parent either gives a cottage to a child or dies still owning the cottage is considered to have been sold for fair market value for tax purposes.
That's the deemed disposition.
That's the dreaded deemed disposition. On death or gift, which some people don't understand. It happens on a gift to a child as well. And that deemed disposition can trigger a massive amount of capital gains tax, and there are always questions about how to fund the payment of that tax.
Okay. Now, say the parents are alive, can they give a portion of the cottage as a gift year by year to avoid tax?
Well, they can give a little bit at a time. The proportionate share of the capital gains tax will be triggered each year.
Oh.
So you can't really get away from the tax. It's all a question. The tax is going to be paid when both spouses who own the cottage are both deceased. The tax has to be paid. It's really a question of when more than if.
Mm-hmm. Well, people in the life insurance world say that the best time to pay the tax is at the time of death, and to use life insurance proceeds to pay for that cost.
For sure. In tax law, what we're trying to do much of the time is defer tax, knowing that we cannot avoid tax. And so death is about the latest time to which we can defer tax. And so death coming at a time when life insurance proceeds can flow, that makes the timing work out quite well to use life insurance as the source of funds for tax. And we have to talk about who's going to pay the premiums on the life insurance, but I've seen a number of cases where the children are happy to pay the premiums on the life insurance on the lives of their parents, knowing that it will provide them a source of money to pay capital gains tax later down the road.
Mm-hmm. When I think of an estate, I normally think of it being a pile of money, and then you can divvy it up among different family members very easily. But a cottage is a physical property.
That's one of the major challenges of cottages versus other types of assets, that really cottages are not divisible like a bank account is divisible. And so quite commonly, my clients who are parents want to leave the cottage to all of their children together. Mm-hmm. And so we start getting into co-ownership arrangements among the children. And so instead of owning all of an asset, a child might own a third of the cottage. They might not own anything else with their siblings, but they own the cottage with their siblings. And then you get into difficult decisions about who pays for what, who gets to stay in the cottage at what times, what weekends are open for anyone to drop in, what weekends are my family only please weekends, even who's restocking the beer in the fridge. All of these can be issues when you have one cottage being co-owned by a number of people.
It does sound very complicated. Do parents typically divide the cottage equally among their children?
Parents have done all sorts of arrangements in my experience. So very commonly the children share equally.
Okay.
At least the parent wants that, and then I have to be the one to ask whether both the children have the financial resources to deal with the cottage and pay the expenses of the cottage on an ongoing basis. I have had cases where parents have left the cottage to one child, generally the child with more financial resources, and has left other assets of the estate to their other child to make up for it.
Okay, so an estate equalization type of approach.
Yes, and sometimes life insurance is used for estate equalization in that context as well, to provide more funds to equalize things out.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so if there's one child that lives, say, in another country or very far away, then maybe they get other parts of the estate rather than the cottage.
Exactly.
You also talk about something that I don't even understand. You talk about the matrimonial home. What is that? I've heard of a principal residence.
Yes. Well, the matrimonial home is a family law concept. What happens on a separation or a divorce is that unless there's a marriage contract, and 99% of the time there's not a marriage contract.
Oh, so they're not common even today?
No, in Quebec they are, but not in the rest of Canada, despite lawyers advising people to get them all the time. There is a payment of money called an equalization payment made between the spouses to let them go on their merry ways separately. Mm-hmm. Now, the matrimonial home is a very special asset because it's always shared equally between the two spouses. Mm-hmm. Even if one spouse owned the house prior to the marriage, Doesn't matter. Even if one spouse paid completely for the matrimonial home, it doesn't matter. It's always shared 50-50. And some people know that, but what people sometimes fail to appreciate is that you can have more than one matrimonial home.
Yeah, that's the part I didn't understand. So I guess the normal situation it would be where the matrimonial home is also the principal residence.
Exactly. And so that's pretty clearly shared equally.
Right. But then the cottage can also be a matrimonial home?
Any home where a spouse has an ownership interest and where the family spends any time in it is a matrimonial home. So a cottage can be a matrimonial home. A Florida condo could be a matrimonial home. People can have many more than one matrimonial homes. So one of the implications of that is that, let's take the example of a brother and sister owning a cottage together. That's how their parents left it to them. And the brother's getting divorced.
Okay.
The brother may have to pay his ex-wife 25% of the value of the cottage as part of the divorce proceedings.
Okay.
So that causes major issues if brother does not have that kind of ready cash hanging around. Now he's going to his sister saying, got to sell my share of the cottage to you, sister, because I need some money. She may say, I can't afford to buy it from you. And sometimes the whole cottage ends up getting sold just to deal with the divorce of the brother in that case.
Okay, so even though the sister would like to keep it and she would want to pay a fair price if she could, she's just not in that situation.
She might not have the assets to do that at that time. And it is a time-sensitive matter in that when the money is owed to the ex-spouse, the money is owed.
Oh, you can't say that it'll be within a year or 2 years or anything like that?
Depends on your relationship with your ex-spouse.
Which may not be the
Which
best
may not
at
be
that
very
time.
amicable, exactly.
Is there something the parents could have done when they were dealing with the cottage that could have prevented this?
Well, where there's a major concern about that particular issue, I tend to have a conversation with the parents about whether the cottage should be left to their children in a cottage trust rather than directly to the children. It's not a bulletproof solution, but it provides a lot more legroom for the child. It provides more options for the child to protect themselves from having to potentially lose the cottage as the result of a divorce or separation.
I gather in that situation, the cottage trust owns the cottage?
That's the one legal theory, is that the brother in that case could say to his ex-wife, I don't actually own the cottage, the trust owns the cottage, therefore it's not something that we equalize. Now, we can't rely on that. Family law courts have looked through those arrangements at times, but often how we would structure a trust like that is to have a number of what are called beneficiaries of the trust. So not just the brother, but also the brother's children and the sister and her children. And as a result, it allows us to make the argument that whatever it is the brother owns, it's much smaller than half the value of the cottage.
Oh, I see, because the feeling is that there are many more owners.
Exactly. The theory is that the trustees have the power to give the cottage essentially to any of the beneficiaries or none of the beneficiaries at that time. And therefore, what does the brother actually own? And we can make the argument that it's pretty minimal.
One other point that you mentioned, the sixth issue, is that legal ownership can be messy. I don't see how. It just seems like you have your name on a document and everything's simple.
You would wish it were that way, but unfortunately, often it's not. So sometimes parents own a cottage, at least everyone thinks that they own a cottage. But 30 years ago, back when they purchased the cottage, for whatever reason, they decided to put their children's names on the legal title as the legal owners of the cottage.
And why might they do that?
Well, there's some people are concerned about something called probate tax, and they hope that they're going to get away without paying it by doing that.
And probate tax is what?
It's an Ontario-based tax that gets triggered upon the death of an owner. It's a payment made to the Ontario government to acquire something called a probate certificate.
Okay, so the parents are concerned about probate tax, so they do what?
They put the children's names on title, figuring that the children will inherit the cottage anyway, and they're just anticipating that by the 30 years or however long it is.
That sounds good.
Yes, the problem is that having different people on title than the people who really, truly, honestly own that cottage causes all sorts of issues. There's also parents putting children's names on title thinking that they're avoiding the capital gains tax that we talked about before, whereas that is not the case. And so unfortunately, parents can end up thinking that they're saving some tax that they're actually not saving at all.
Okay, so there are quite a few issues that are involved that people may not have been thinking about.
That's right. And they tend not to know about the issues until they sit down and start talking about the cottage and how they're going to leave it to the children. And putting the children's names on title to the cottage can cause the children their own tax issues at times, given that your child may have their own home in the city, and to also be an owner of a cottage may not be the cleanest tax situation for the child.
Okay. What's your key message for the people watching today?
My key message is that cottages are so well loved and so emotional for people that we don't think too rationally about them sometimes. And the reality is they're far more complex assets than the vast majority of other things that we own. And so for the sake of our families, we need to take the time and the trouble to delve into the cottage issues and to look at these challenges and to make a plan for the cottage that hopefully will keep it in the family if that's what everybody wants.
And your own family has done that, which is terrific.
I hope that we have. Time will tell, but I've been through it myself personally, so I can attest to how challenging it can be, but how it relieves the mind to think that there's a solid plan in place.
What's the best way for people to reach you?
I have a website, basilaw.com, and my email is Katy, Katy, @basilaw.com, or you can call me at 905-237-9299.
Thanks for dropping by.
Thank you so much, Pramod.
Thanks for joining us for Tea at Taxevity. The Taxevity Insurance Advisory helps you understand insurance and bridges gaps in your coverage. There's no premium for peace of mind. How healthy is your insurance?